Welcome to the Language Alchemy Podcast, and thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Alejandra Siroka, a transformative communication teacher and coach who is devoted to helping multicultural individuals and couples engaged in personal growth transform their lives and relationships through conscious communication. Thank you so much for being here today. This episode is going to be a rich and deep conversation about language, healing, yoga, Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, and social awakening. Yes, a lot. And I'm so thankful for my guest, Dr. Scott Blossom, who is my number one influencer. Why? Because he has influenced so many aspects of my life, including how I breathe, how I practice yoga, what I eat and when, in which season, what I wear and why. He also influenced even how I structure my days, meaning what I do when I wake up, how I wake up, what I do after I wake up, what I do in the middle of the day, what I do in the evening, how I go to bed. You see, so many aspects of my life. So, welcome, my dear Dr. Scott Blossom.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a great introduction. And I want to say too that you're one of my primary influencers
Mm.
because we've known each other for a long time now, and the ways that you have grown into such a wise woman. And through the work that you're doing with alchemical language, it's influenced everything that I do. And I'm just constantly inspired by you. So thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually want to say a little bit more about you, Scott, because there are people who may not know you, people who would be listening to you for the first time. And I want the whole world to know Scott because Scott is a doctor, he's a healer, he is an alchemist who has integrated traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, Ayurveda, yoga somatics, and evidence based nutrition into his clinical practice and his beautiful educational offerings for more than 25 years. His experience has taught him that one secret to health is not a what, it's not a product or just one specific practice, but how to adapt to whatever you're doing so that you remain potent and agile through the days and the seasons of your life, which again, I can attest that you did for us and for Matthew, for both of us. I'm really inspired by Scott in so many ways. And when I was reading, Scott, in your website, that your mission is to inspire a regenerative revolution for individuals and society through multidimensional self care, sacred reciprocity, and collective healing. I was wowed by the power of these words. And I also want to say one more thing. Scott has been my teacher, my guide for, I think, over 15 years. And my client, over the years, we have cultivated a deep, loving friendship of mutual support. And I even call you my spiritual brother. So we have so many different layers of
Mm,
connection, Scott.
mm,
Thank you so, so much for being here at the Language Alchemy podcast.
Thank you.
I have so many questions for you. Let's start with the fact that you are a seasoned yoga teacher, a leader, and Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine doctor, and a committed spiritual practitioner. And I've seen over these 15 years that I've known you how you have been working on your language and communication. And tell us why this is important for you in how you show up in the world with all these beautiful education and wisdom that you have gathered and integrated over the years.
Mm. Yeah, the first thing that when you ask that question that way, the first thing that I think about is that, it's multidimensional in the sense of the way that I look at my own health and what has helped me along the way, and the way I work with clients that I have too, all through in the educational offerings, have always been multidimensional, meaning we're going to touch on the physical body, we're
Yeah.
going to touch on the subtle body, we're going to touch on spiritual practice. And it's a lot because it makes there more to have to cover. But I recently saw a headline about Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases in general, but specifically around Alzheimer's and the genes that can. In this case, the headline was that if you have a certain set of genes, you're predetermined pretty much to get Alzheimer's. And they were using data from brain studies of people who had passed away. And they were able to show if you have these two copies of this specific allele, which is a variant of the gene that is most influential for Alzheimer's, you will end up producing the physiological evidence that you're having the brain changes that are consistent with getting Alzheimer's. But because Alzheimer's is both a physiological and a clinical diagnosis, meaning you have to have the symptoms, it was actually a kind of bias where they're actually putting this genetic bias in and saying something that in actuality doesn't pan out when you do the math of how many people have those sets of genes, how many people actually have Alzheimer's dementia, and that it leaves open that possibility that you can put together your lifestyle, your diet, your psychological and your language practices and your spiritual practices in a way that will have a powerful preventative effect.
Right.
So you are not predetermined, you're not fixated. We know there's massive neuroplasticity. And so in the way that you asked the question, it's all kind of me using that example to say that for me, when I was younger, I believed more that the physical actions and the food that I was eating was going to have this massive, massive impact. But as I grew and matured and started to recognize how, oh, my emotional patterning is having this really big impact on my health. And of course, those emotions drive certain belief patterns that I articulate as language to myself or to others.
Mm-hmm.
You've really helped me to understand that in a lot of ways, it's like if a belief pattern and an emotional feeling that's associated with that belief pattern has a kind of gestalt, it has a whole, then the language are literally the fibers that make up the weave of that pattern. And so by changing those, by looking at those, and I love language. I've always been a fan of etymology too, of
Yeah.
knowing the Latin roots or the Sanskrit roots or whatever the roots might be to a particular word. The use of language, especially self talk, is something that has a subtle influence that trickles down into the physical layers of health. So that has made me even more determined to stay with not saying, oh, I'm a diet person. I continue to insist on this kind of, you could say, a generalist approach to health, but it isn't generalist in the sense of you can't separate these things. So you can't separate the physical body from the language you happen to think in or the way that spiritual practices change identity and
Mm-hmm.
therefore change the language you would think about yourself from that more intuitive side or maybe a less like discursive thought side of things.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that on the one hand, we are predetermined to certain things, and yet there's a huge possibility for us to work preventative with anything. And we have the ability, thanks to neuroplasticity and other things, to make changes and to look at what we have, where we're heading. Is that
Yes.
what we want? Is that working? Is that beneficial? And if not, do what we need to do to shift that.
Yes.
You were talking about the way you practice as a general way. I think
Mhm.
of it more as an integrated way.
Yes.
Just like you and me too, the way I work with language is in an integrated way, looking at the impact in physiology and psychology, interpersonal relationship, the kind of world we're creating and leaving, not just future generations, but that we're co-creating together, the kind of communities, all that impact that language has. And you are doing that not only with language, but also with physical practices, spiritual practices. All of these is really integrated. It's just so beautiful. And you talked about becoming aware of the role that all these multi layers of our being have. What is something that you have become aware more and more in language and communication in your work? You and I have talked many times about Ayurvedic psychology, something that I learned from you and from Dr. Svoboda,
Mm,
and how each person with each particular dosha speaks or uses language differently. So, for
mm.
people who may not know even what Ayurveda is, can you tell us first, what is Ayurveda? What are the doshas? I know these are, we can have like whole podcast episodes about this, but as quickly as you can.
Yes, and I have had to do this many times. Ayurveda translates as the science of health and longevity from the Sanskrit language from India. It's a holistic health system that has thousands of years of trial and error and the evidence and data that they collect from that to guide people toward not only health in the moment, but health through the arc of somebody's life. It's fundamentally concerned with prevention and longevity. And specifically, it's contextual medicine in the sense of the answer to any question in Ayurveda is it depends, because it depends on the context for the person, all of the patterning.
I
Yeah.
love it. I'm raising my arms because I always say communication depends on the context when someone asks me a question. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. But yeah. And so when you break down some of the key principles that in Sanskrit are called doshas, they have to do with, you could say, the physiological, neurological, and to some degree psychological, deeply ingrained tendencies. And the image of like the way that we weave together our world with language is when we say somebody that something's dyed in the wool. It means when a dye goes in and it gets set, it's hard to get it back out. That's what
Mhm.
bleach is for. In some ways, like language alchemy is like the bleach for that dye, so you actually free things up and then you start adding different colors to
Mhm.
something that might be more appropriate, more supportive for a
Yeah.
given context. And so it breaks down along metabolic principles very easily. Metabolism has two primary qualities to it. One is catabolism, which is breaking bonds to create energy so you can fuel your body's heartbeat as well as exercise and make creative thoughts and all the things that you have to do. The other side of it is anabolic. Anabolic is when you restore the body, you nourish the body. The body creates a stored form of energy that can then be utilized for work later. And so this catabolism and anabolism are constantly going back and forth. And the intelligence that's working with that is your metabolism. So in Ayurveda, catabolism is called vata, anabolism is called kapha, and metabolism is called pitta. The key to understand is that our metabolism also gives us instincts and intuitions. It doesn't just work at the physical level, it's also going to influence mood and what we feel like is right or wrong, wise or foolish in any given moment. The basic principle with Ayurveda is people who, like myself, tend to run thin. And if I go out of balance, I will tend to lose weight. It's because my system is dominated by a catabolic attitude. There's more catabolicness in me than, say, anabolicness. And so the metabolism has a little bit of a bias that way. And then another body type that may gain weight easily and have to really manage from that side of not becoming overweight, their body type will often, at a very deeply ingrained level, have a bias toward anabolism. So,
Mhm.
and that doesn't just express in the physical body, it can also express in the mind. And then you have the third type, which is the metabolic type. And there are people that have very strong willpower and often very clear ideas of what should be done and what they can do because they're actually wielding both tools. Their challenge is about how to have that much power that they can
Yeah.
actually go either way because it can easily turn into a pro inflammatory condition if they start overdoing one thing or another. So, this is a very simple way to talk about it. I really love what you're bringing up because when I have a patient, I have to speak to them from a place that they will understand. And a
Yeah.
person who's catabolic is going to require a different kind of languaging to support their attitude, which is usually like, tell me what to do. I want to do something, because they're catabolic, so they want to apply effort. And then the other person may want a totally different way of languaging something, because an anabolic type, they're willing to do things, but they often have a predisposition to prefer methodology, and they want to make sure there's a plan. They want it to be like, here's how it goes. Whereas the other type is more, because they're very powerful, you actually speak to them like you're speaking to a peer. Like, we're working on this together. And yes, I'm the doctor and I have special training, but you're so capable that you're the best patient in the world. We're going to do great. And then they go, yes, thank you so much for seeing me and all of my power. And here we go. So it's those variations.
Wow. It's so important to speak in the language that people can understand. I'm blanking on the name now of this seminal book on activism called Radical Activism, where the author says, if you are an activist, then you understand the language people you are trying to support and activate use. And then you speak that language first. Then you can create a movement. Then you can have a revolution.
Right.
Then you can change the world. But it
Yes.
all starts from language and understanding what language that, in your case, that patient speaks, or in my case, that client speaks.
Yes. Yes.
And this
Exactly.
is something that we have known for, millennia, right? Ayurveda is an ancient wisdom, medicine, science.
Yes. Yeah. And this is what it's sometimes referred to as bedside manner for doctors.
Mm.
The bedside manner is that you attune to the person you're with and you speak to them in a way and move around them and communicate with your body in a way that they can relate to, that they feel connected to.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And of course, you have the training and the experience of pretty much knowing right away when someone has a particular dosha.
Yeah.
And if people wanted to find that out, like, am I more anabolic, metabolic, catabolic? How would
Yeah.
they find that?
We have a free test on my website. It's Dr. Blossom, DOCTOR, Blossom, BLOSSOM.com. And so if you go through that, you'll figure out what your proportions of the doshas are. And then there's lots of information that follows up that's also on my website about, here's some basic ideas about what you can do.
It's a great test, and I highly suggest all of you to take it. I'll add the links in the show notes. It has helped me understand so much about myself, about
Yeah.
my beloved, about people around me, and also my clients, And for many of my clients or former clients who are listening to this episode, this is when you've heard me say, oh, there's a lot of fire in you, and why I say that. Or there's a lot of movement and wind in you, or a lot of water and earth in you.
Yeah.
And once they say, yes, how do you know? Well, then we can shift. If there's a lot of fire, well, these are the things we need to do in our communication. If there's too much movement, you're speaking too fast and you're going from one idea to the next,
Yes.
let's
Yes.
slow down and let's really look at how you're communicating. Or if there's, stuckness and not enough movement and consistent shutting down, and okay, let's activate ourselves and look at practices, not just linguistic practices, but other practices that will help you activate
Yeah.
yourself.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think what you're speaking to too that relates to language is the narrative that you get when you understand what your primary orientation is around the doshas really helps you to anticipate what your particular genius is, what your particular form of balance will look like,
Right.
and what your most likely forms of imbalance will look like. So if everything's balanced out, then just go with the flow, trust, you can really lean into that. But if things are out of balance, you have to actually attenuate. You have to work against the stream that's carrying you into imbalance. And that narrative sets up a very important story and for choices that you might make that are not being articulated one at a time. So it's not like the doctor tells you everything to do. I think you've probably experienced this too, is you start understanding at a different level, oh, this situation has this quality or that quality. So I can apply this narrative to help interpret this
Mm-hmm.
scenario. And just for anybody at home that wants to maybe cultivate the superpower that you're talking about of recognizing somebody's elemental tone, the two easiest things are actually eyes and voice. It's always dangerous to read a book by the cover, but somebody's eyes and their voice are two of the most reliable ways to kind of tune into who they are elementally. So, like you said, a person who has more air and space, say they tend to be speak quickly, their eyes tend to move around a lot. A person who's more earth and water will tend to speak slowly, often with a cadence that's very rhythmic, and their eyes tend to be very sort of still and steady. And then the person who's the more fiery type will have that penetrating gaze, and they'll have very often a sharp tongue and a lot of power in their words and emotional force in their words.
Yeah, I love that. So, for all of you who are looking at us, can you tell who we are?
Yeah, right.
If you're looking at us and you're listening to this on YouTube, but can you tell us, Scott, who we both are?
Yeah, we share this in common. We're both air and fire.
Yes, we're both
Yeah,
air and fire. Yes, great
yes.
combination.
And that is good to say too, that it isn't as simple as you're one thing or another. You're all the five elements and you have emphases. And most of us have more than one that's actually sharing the balance of that emphasis. But some people are more singly something and they have a very particular quality to them too.
Yeah, absolutely. How has all this impacted your awareness in how you communicate in your personal life? You talked about how you, in a very wise and skillful way, you work with your patients and your students. How has that translated into how you live your own personal life?
Mm, yeah. As you're phrasing the question, I'm aware that it's harder.
Yeah.
It's harder to live it in my personal life. I have raised two kids. I have a teenage boy that I'm raising. His elder sib is already out of the house and has graduated college. And that makes me think of a lot of things that you've actually helped me with around the self talk comes before the relational talk.
Yeah.
Because if I'm going to speak from a place of fear and I'm unconscious to the fact that I'm shaming that fearful part or reacting to it in a way that actually has lack of compassion or lack of love in it, that I often will end up speaking words that are communicating that part of myself rather than the part that can hold all the parts that I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful way of understanding this, that doing this at a personal level is the hardest because that's where we have so much patterning around how to communicate in intimate relationships that we have learned, absorbed, integrated, assimilated during our first 7 years of life, that this is where really it requires so much more effort because there's so much more emotionality, like all these multidimensional, all these threads that you were mentioning. There are
Yeah.
more threads there are more dimensions there when it's
Yes.
in our personal life than when it's a working relationship with a patient, a client, a student.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like there's the charges are stronger.
Yeah. And so it comes back to that awareness, having that knowing of like what's happening. Am I coming from fear? Am I coming from anger? And looking at that before, communicating that to the other person and listening to that in our internal dialogue.
Yeah.
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 Exactly.
I see you, Scott, as someone who's so deeply committed to growing. And I've witnessed that growth in you in these 15 years and all the multi layers and multidimensional ways in which we are connected. So lovingly, respectfully, beautifully connected. And I've also seen lately in the last 4 years, perhaps the catalyst may have been the murder of George Floyd, that seeing you awaken even more to a social level, a social awakening and understanding of the world. You have done so much in the yoga community, in the healing community, to bring awareness to these issues. I see your language has changed and evolved in this respect. I've heard you, and because I follow your newsletter, and I invite everybody to sign up to Dr. Blossom's newsletter, which are funny and poignant, deep, personal, and so inviting and thought provoking. You've talked about decolonizing yoga. You've talked about so many times, like even in your email address, naming the ancestors of the land from which you are emailing from. And you are talking so much in the last few years about equity and groups that you're involved with. So, can you talk a little bit about that layer again, like this multi levels, multi dimensions that we're talking about, how that has informed how you help others heal, how you lead in your work and personal life?
I remember when it was George Floyd that really catalyzed a kind of commitment that was much more serious and now feels like a lifetime commitment.
Yeah.
And I found a community, an affinity group of white men who identify as white men with all of the attendant privilege and power that comes in that, being in that particular intersection of society, where a great teacher in that space that teaches about the somatic aspect of internalized racism is Resmaa Menakem. He basically said a lot of white people are getting activated by this event. We'll see who sticks around, because this isn't something that you do for a year. This is something that takes you 3 to 10 years just to do the first step.
Mm-hmm.
And so luckily, I'm in an organization called White Men for Racial Justice. And these are men who, at some level, we agree with that principle, that the work that needs to be done, the social justice and the multicultural, multiracial, pluralistic possibilities of a really functional democracy are probably something beyond our lives. And that was something that took years to really let it in. It took a lot of data points, you could say, for me to recognize that. For me, the change in language is a recognition, partly that with traditions that I've studied, and I've been very drawn to Eastern traditions. I've studied Ayurvedic medicine, which is connected to the yoga tradition because those are both traditions from India. I also studied traditional Chinese medicine because I got turned on to all this very young and I wanted to learn those systems of medicine to practice them. And that those systems of medicine incorporate a worldview that would now be called animistic. And animistic implies that everything has consciousness.
Animus.
Yeah, everything's
Mm-hmm.
alive, and so you could say post-colonial capitalist mind frame, one of its major blind spots, because they're not going to paint it all bad, but the idea that you could take something for yourself and exploit it for your own benefit without a sacred reciprocity in that relationship. It started with something like, we're going to go in and take over these lands and we're going to dispossess these people and commit genocide and do some really horrific things in the name of empire building. And then now it can be something as simple as a doctor like me coming on and saying, hey, take this herb. Even the language, take this herb, it implies this herb will probably do something good for you, but the herb has to have its own intelligence for you to actually receive that benefit. And so if I don't honor that intelligence, then I'm living in a very different world. It's a world that negates the power of history and my
Mm-hmm.
ancestry and the intergenerational forces, which we now know from trauma research has so much power on us. And I love that that's kind of coming around, like studies like the microbiome, which I'm terribly interested in, as well as studies around trauma, are helping us to see that we're not just people that landed here. And it's
Mhm.
about us taking what we need and want to make our lives great, as if that was the plan, because traditional viewpoints are never centered the individual. They always centered the community. And in that community, they're centering relationship. And so, if I was going to put it in one word, what I would say is the word that changed things is to look around the world and know that relationship is functional at radically diverse and complex level, even when I'm just lying in bed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if I'm by
Mhm.
myself and I'm resting and I'm half asleep, those relationships are still at play because I'm supported by the earth that's supporting the bed and the sheets and all the hands that went into making those sheets and the
Yeah.
crop that grew, and it's all the things. And to remember them intellectually, it's to live in that web. And these systems that I've studied, thank goodness, slowly but surely, I would think I was an extremely slow learner. It took me into my 50s to sort of wake up to it. But part of the way it expresses itself is also the recognition that social justice is not separate from that animistic worldview that says that collective liberation, that I need you as much or more than you need me, and that my giving into it and my receiving, that's the art. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're bringing up something that I've been writing about a lot as I'm writing my book, The Language of Interconnectedness, to understand that whatever we say has an impact, not just on ourselves, but also on others in the relationship. And there is that sense of reciprocity and interconnectedness. And even with communication, most of the communication approaches and books that you read are about transactional communication
Yes. Yeah.
instead of relational communication and being in relationship to all beings, the way we talk to our pets, the way we talk to the plants. We have a garden, and when we remove something we grew, to ask the earth, oh, may I have this tomato? Thank you so much. I go around in the morning and thank all of our fruit trees. Thank you. Oh, look at those apples. They're so beautiful. Oh, lemons. Thank you. And what a difference that makes when we understand that there is that interconnectedness and that it's not about us versus them, but when it is beneficial, loving, equitable, we all benefit and we can all thrive. And there is enough for everybody. But in order to do that, we need to look at the history, as you said. We need to come in touch with the pain of the history. We need to look at how we have perpetuated that pain unknowingly, perhaps, that we have inherited these systems of
Yes.
communication, oppression, dominance, and then we look at our values, what we want for our world, for ourselves, and
Yes.
then we can shift all that language.
Yes.
I want to say you are so aware about this and speak up so much about this. I see it all over your website, in every email, in our personal communications. And it takes time, right, to have these social awakenings and any kind of awakening. It takes time. It's not something like, okay, you take a leap and then everything is different. And now you are living in the world in such a different way. I remember when Matthew and I started studying with you, you asked us for a 7-year commitment. Do you remember that?
I do.
And we stuck around for double that, and still going.
Yeah.
And it takes 7 years to get the whole download of a language. Doesn't it also take 7 years for all our cells to rejuvenate and regenerate the cells in our body?
Mm, mm. I don't know that, but I'll look into that. That's interesting.
That's what I read many times, that
Yeah.
we are not the same. Even like all the cells in our heart, everything changes every 7 years, that it takes a
Yeah.
process of 7 years.
Right. Right.
And so, awakening with our language and understanding the interconnectedness and the social implications and how we are sometimes unknowingly perpetuating that pain
Yes.
may take 7 years as well. This is the first part of the conversation with Dr. Blossom. In our next episode, we're going to keep talking about the language of healing, especially in personal relationships. Thank you so much for listening. Until the next episode. And as we say in Argentina, ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Original music by Gary Lapo. You can find all links at languagealchemy.com.